My children, hungry for their inheritance, thought I was just a frail, grieving widow. The day of my husband's funeral, they drove me to a forgotten nursing home and left me with nothing, believing they had finally seized control of the family empire. They clutched a will they thought was their key to everything. They had no idea it was a decoy, a trap set for them by their own father. He hadn't left them a fortune. He had left me a password. A single word that would activate a secret trust and turn their entire world to dust. That nursing home wasn't my prison cell. It was the trigger for their ruin. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Cynthia Sinclair. My children tried to bury me, to erase me from the story my husband and I had written together. They did not realize that I was not just a character in the story. I was the co-author. And I had reserved the right to write the final chapter. The lesson was a painful one for them and for me. But it was a necessary one. A true inheritance is not a sum of money to be spent. It is a set of values to be lived. And that is a lesson that some people, my children included, must be forced to learn. I still remember that day, the day my husband died, the day my kids betrayed me. The air in the room was a thief. It stole the scent of the rain-soaked earth after a summer storm, the smell of Robert's Old Spice aftershave, the aroma of yeast rolls rising in the kitchen of my own home. It replaced them with the sterile trinity of bleach, boiled cabbage, and a faint, cloying sweetness that hinted at decay. This was the smell of the end of a life, and my children, by own flesh and blood, had decided it was the only air I was fit to breathe. I sat on the edge of a narrow bed, the vinyl mattress crinkling beneath my weight like a sigh of resignation. The room was a study in beige, a color that commits to nothing. Beige walls, beige linoleum, a beige metal-framed window that looked out onto a patch of browning grass and a chain-link fence. This was my new world. Pleasant Meadows Senior Care. The name was a cruelty, a lie whispered into the void. There was nothing pleasant about this meadow of forgotten souls. They had left me here less than an hour ago. The drive from Shiloh Baptist Church, from the final somber farewell to my husband of 52 years, was a blur of muted grief and rising dread. My son, Robert Jr., Ari, had driven the Lincoln Navigator with a grim set to his jaw, his eyes fixed on the road, refusing to meet my gaze in the rearview mirror. My daughter, Denise, sat beside me, her hand patting mine with a rhythmic, meaningless pressure. Her touch was cold even through her leather gloves. They had spoken in the hushed, gentle tones one uses for the terminally ill or the profoundly senile. They spoke of rest, of peace, of a place where I wouldn't have to worry about a thing. They spoke of love. It was the most profound lie I had ever been told. We had left the familiar, comforting grandeur of Washington, D.C., the stately brick homes of Crestwood with their manicured lawns and ancient oaks, and driven deep into the anonymous heart of rural Maryland. The city's confident skyline had receded, replaced by flat, empty fields and skeletal trees clawing at a pewter sky. When RJ finally turned onto a cracked asphalt driveway, my heart had seized. The building was a long, low brick rectangle, its architecture as devoid of hope as a prison. He had parked the car and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. "This is for the best, Mama," Denise had said, her voice a smooth, practiced caress. "You're exhausted. Grieving. You need professional care." Care. I had managed to whisper, my voice a dry rustle of leaves. "My home is on Decatur Street. My life is there." RJ had finally turned around, his face a mask of strained patience. He was 52, my firstborn, a man who wore his father's name like a costume he had yet to grow into. "Mama, be reasonable. You can't manage that big house alone. Company, everything. It's too much. We'll handle it now." And then came the final, brutal blow, the words that would echo in the beige room and in the hollows of my heart for the rest of my days. He had gotten out, opened my door and helped me to my feet with a grip that was more steel than comfort. He led me towards the entrance, Denise flanking my other side, a guard of honor escorting a prisoner to her cell. At the reception desk, a tired-looking woman with a name tag that read Brenda had looked up, her expression unchanging. "We're checking in Cynthia Sinclair," Arde had announced, his voice booming with a false confidence that had always grated on me. Brenda had slid a clipboard across the counter. While he signed the papers that would commit me to this purgatory, Denise had leaned in close, her perfume expensive and suffocating, filling my lungs. "This is where you belong now, Mama," she'd whispered, her words meant for me alone. "The house and the company are ours. We will manage the inheritance." She had squeezed my arm, a final, proprietary gesture. They hadn't even walked me to my room. They had turned, their duty done, and walked out of the automatic doors without a backward glance. They left me with nothing. No handbag with my wallet and keys. No overnight bag with a change of clothes or my toiletries. No telephone to call for help. No money. They had stripped me of my identity, of my agency, of my very self, and left me standing in the lobby of a strange and terrifying place, an 80-pound ghost in a black funeral dress. That's when I realized they were not my children. Not in any way that mattered. They were parasites, creatures that had feasted on the life Robert and I had built, and now that the host was weakened, they were moving in to consume what was left. What they didn't know, what their greed and arrogance had made them blind to, was that my husband, my brilliant, far-sighted Robert, had always seen the rot within them. And he had prepared something for me before he died. He had left me a key. A key. The thought was a single, flickering candle in the vast, crushing darkness. It was a memory from a few months ago, a quiet evening in Robert's study. He had been looking over some legal documents, his brow furrowed. He had looked up at me, his eyes, usually so full of warmth and humor, were clouded with a deep, weary sadness. "Cynthia," he had said, his voice low and grave, "if they ever forget who you are, if they ever treat you like a piece of furniture instead of the queen you are, I've left you a key. Just get to Hayes. Promise me you'll remember that. Get to Lawrence Hayes." I had promised, confused but trusting. Now sitting on this final bed in this beige hell, the promise was a lifeline. They thought they had left me with nothing. But they had left me with my mind. And in my mind, I held the memory of my husband's love, and the name of the man who held the key to my salvation. Robert and I built our life on a foundation of red clay and rebar. He was the architect, the visionary who could see a cathedral in a vacant lot, and I was the accountant, the pragmatist who knew exactly how many bricks and how much sweat it would take to make his vision a reality. Our company, Sinclair and Son Construction, was a misnomer from the start. It should have been Sinclair and Spouse. Robert drew the blueprints, but I read the fine print. He charmed the city council, but I balanced the ledgers. For 52 years we were a symphony in two parts, a partnership so seamless that most people, including our own children, only ever heard his melody. They never understood that my quiet harmony was what gave the music its strength. We started in 1973 with a second-hand pickup truck, a set of tools Robert had inherited from his father, and a small loan from my uncle. I had just passed my CPA exam, and my office was a card table set up in the corner of our tiny apartment in Brightwood. Robert would come home, his hands calloused and his clothes caked in the red dust of DC earth, and spread his drawings across the kitchen table. He'd talk of load-bearing walls and stress tolerances, of roof pitches and drainage grades. I'd listen, and then I'd open my ledger and talk of profit margins and amortization schedules, of payroll taxes and supplier credit lines. He was the poet of concrete and steel. I was the grammarian of the bottom line. He couldn't have built a thing without me, and I would have had nothing to count without him. Our first big break was a contract to build a small community center for a church in Anacostia. The budget was shoestring tight, the timeline impossible. The city's old guard of contractors laughed at the ambitious young couple trying to make a name for themselves. But Robert's design was innovative and my numbers were airtight. We brought the project in on time and under budget. The quality of the work spoke for itself. That small community center became our calling card. It led to another, then a row of townhouses, then a small office building. By the time RJ was born, Sinclair and Son was a respected name in the city. By the time Denise arrived 4 years later, we were a force. I remember bringing the children to the work sites on Saturdays. Robert would hoist a small RJ onto his shoulders and walk the steel skeletons of his buildings, pointing out the future, a world he was literally constructing before their eyes. I would hold Denise's hand, trying to explain the magic of it all. "Look," I'd say, pointing to a team of men pouring a concrete foundation. "That's what holds everything up. Without a strong foundation, the whole building will crumble." They would nod, their eyes wide, but I don't think they ever truly understood. They saw the towering cranes and the finished buildings, the symbols of wealth and power. They never saw the foundation. They never saw me. As they grew older, the disconnect widened. They were children of privilege, raised in the beautiful home in Crestwood that Robert had designed and I had paid for. They went to the best private schools, wore the best clothes, drove the best cars. They saw the company as a magical machine that produced money, a birthright that required no effort on their part. RJ, despite the "and" son in the company name, showed little interest in the actual work. He majored in marketing in college, a field that felt flimsy and insubstantial to me. He was good at the glad handing, the long lunches, the performative aspects of business. But he had no patience for the details, for the grueling, unglamorous work of turning a blueprint into a building. He saw the company as a stage for his ambition, not a legacy to be protected. Denise was different but no less disappointing. She was obsessed with appearances, with social status, with the DC Society pages. She married a man whose family name was older than ours but whose fortune was a fraction of it. She saw Sinclair and Son as her personal bank, a source of funds for her endless renovations, her European vacations, her children's exorbitant tuition. She treated me with a kind of affectionate condescension, as if I were a quaint family heirloom, a relic from a bygone era who didn't understand the complexities of modern life. She never once asked about the company's finances, about our investment strategies, about the intricate web of contracts and liabilities that I managed every single day. She just assumed the money would always be there, as reliable and unthinking as the sunrise. Robert saw it all. He was a loving father, but he was not a blind one. He tried to instill his values in them, the values of hard work, integrity, and humility. But it was like trying to plant a rose in a desert. The soil of their souls was too shallow, too barren. "They're soft, Cynthia," he would say to me late at night after another frustrating attempt to engage RJ in a serious business discussion, or another eye-watering bill from Denise's decorator had arrived. "We made them soft. We wanted to give them everything we never had, and in doing so we forgot to give them the one thing we did have: hunger." It was that hunger, that shared, driving ambition to build something real and lasting, that had been the engine of our lives. We weren't just building structures. We were building a legacy, a testament to the power of a Black family to rise and create and endure in a city that had not always welcomed us. Our children saw the legacy as a finished product, a treasure chest to be divided. They never understood that a legacy is not an inheritance. It is a responsibility. It is a foundation that must be constantly maintained, protected, and strengthened. And as Robert's health began to fail, as the strength in his hands began to wane, I saw the fear in his eyes. It was not a fear of death. It was a fear for the future of the foundation we had laid together. He knew, with a father's broken heart, that the children we had raised were not builders. They were demolition experts. And he knew he had to leave a plan, a final blueprint, to protect his life's work and his life's partner from their own entitled, destructive hands. The funeral was a grand, somber affair, a testament to the life Robert had lived and the city he had helped to build. Shiloh Baptist Church on 9th Street was filled to capacity, its beautiful vaulted ceilings echoing with the mournful strains of a gospel choir and the hushed murmurs of a grieving community. The mayor was there, as were 2 congresswomen, a dozen city council members, and countless business leaders, community activists, and old friends. They came to pay their respects to a man who had been a titan, a pillar of Black DC. But as I sat in the front pew, a black veil obscuring my face, I watched the proceedings with a growing sense of detachment, as if I were watching a play in which I was the central, silent character. My grief was a deep, private ocean, and the public spectacle of the funeral was merely a ripple on its surface. My focus was on my children. They sat beside me, RJ on my right, Denise on my left, the very picture of devoted, grieving offspring. They were performing their roles with an unnerving precision. RJ, dressed in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than my first car, looked stoic and grave, the dutiful son ready to assume his father's mantle. Denise, elegant in a Chanel dress and a wide-brimmed hat, dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, her expression a carefully composed mask of sorrow. But I saw through the performance. I had seen them in the quiet moments before the service, huddled together in the church vestibule, their heads close, their whispers urgent. They weren't sharing memories of their father. They were finalizing their strategy. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the language of their bodies, the impatient glances at their watches, the sharp, decisive nods, the quick, conspiratorial squeeze of a hand. They were closing a deal, and I was the asset being liquidated. When it was his turn to speak, RJ walked to the pulpit with a confident, measured stride. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began a eulogy that was a masterpiece of corporate branding. He spoke of Robert Sinclair not as a father, but as a visionary leader, a titan of industry, an icon of Black entrepreneurship. He used words like legacy, dynasty, and the next generation. He was not eulogizing a man. He was delivering a keynote address at a shareholders' meeting. He painted a picture of a seamless transition, of a son stepping into his father's shoes to carry the torch forward. He spoke of his father's dreams, but all I could hear was his own ambition. He was laying claim to the throne in front of 1,000 witnesses. Then came Denise. She glided to the pulpit, her movements fluid and graceful. Her eulogy was the emotional counterpoint to RJ's corporate speech. She spoke of Daddy, of his warm hugs and his booming laugh. She told charming, sanitized anecdotes from their childhood, stories that had been polished and refined for public consumption. She wept, or rather she produced tears, a feat of emotional stagecraft that was both impressive and repulsive. She spoke of family, of sticking together in times of grief, of honoring their father's memory by protecting their mother. "We will wrap our arms around our dear mother," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion as she looked directly at me. "We will care for her, protect her, and make sure she wants for nothing for the rest of her days." The congregation murmured its approval. A wave of sympathetic amens washed over the sanctuary. They saw a loving daughter. I saw a predator, cloaking her greed in the sacred language of filial piety. Her words were a lullaby meant to soothe the suspicions of the flock while the wolves prepared to slaughter the shepherdess. The most painful moment came from a man who meant only kindness. Reverend Jackson, who had known our family for 40 years, spoke of Robert and me as a unit. He called us a partnership blessed by God, a testament to the power of love and faith in building a life. He looked at me and said, "Cynthia, you were the rock on which Robert built his house. You were the quiet strength, the wise counsel, the unseen hand that guided the ship. We all know that Sinclair and Son was as much your creation as it was his." His words were a balm to my soul, a public acknowledgement of a lifetime of invisible labor. But as I glanced at my children, I saw not pride, but a flicker of pure, unadulterated annoyance. RJ's jaw tightened. Denise's serene mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of irritation. The Reverend's tribute to me was an inconvenience to their narrative. They were the heirs, the protagonists of this new chapter. I was supposed to be a footnote, a dowager queen to be quietly pensioned off, not the co-founder of the empire they were so eager to claim. After the service, as we stood in the receiving line, a long procession of mourners offered their condolences. They squeezed my hand, they hugged me, they whispered their sympathies. And over I heard the same refrain, "You have wonderful children, Cynthia. They will take good care of you." Each time I would nod and force a smile, the words a bitter ash in my mouth. They saw the performance, the beautiful, polished facade of a loving family. They couldn't see the rot beneath the floorboards. They couldn't see the vultures circling, patiently waiting for the last guest to leave so the feast could begin. The funeral was not an end. It was a beginning. It was the coronation of the new regime, a public spectacle designed to legitimize their coup. And as the last mourner departed and the heavy church doors swung shut, I knew that my life as Cynthia Sinclair, wife, partner, and matriarch was over. My new life as a prisoner of my children's greed was about to begin. The ride from the church to the nursing home was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a slow, deliberate journey from a world I knew to a world of unimaginable horror. The Lincoln Navigator, a car I had always associated with family outings and comfortable security, felt like a tumbril carrying me to my execution. The familiar streets of Washington, D.C., a city I had watched grow and change for nearly 8 decades, slid past the tinted windows like scenes from a life that was no longer mine. We drove past Howard University where I had met Robert, its stately brick buildings a reminder of a youth filled with hope and promise. We drove past the construction sites bearing the proud Sinclair and Son logo, monuments to a lifetime of shared work and ambition. Each landmark was a fresh stab of pain, a farewell to a piece of myself. RJ drove with a grim, focused silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The silence was a weapon designed to isolate and intimidate me. Denise, my captor in couture, continued her performance of gentle concern. She offered me a bottle of water which I refused. She asked if I was comfortable, a question so absurdly cruel it almost made me laugh. Comfortable? I was being systematically erased from my own life and she was asking about my comfort. Her voice was the velvet glove on the iron fist of their betrayal. "We've been so worried about you, Mama," she began, her tone soft and reasonable. "Ever since Daddy got sick, you've been under so much strain. And now, well, now you need to rest. You need a place where you can be looked after properly." "I have a home," I said, my voice thin but steady. "A home that your father and I built together. I have friends. I have a life." "A life that was built around Daddy," RJ interjected, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence from the driver's seat. "That life is over now. You have to accept that. We are trying to help you move on." Move on. The phrase was an obscenity. They weren't helping me move on. They were moving me out. They were treating my grief as a medical condition, a form of temporary insanity that rendered me incapable of managing my own affairs. It was a classic power play, a way to seize control by declaring the person in power incompetent. They were using my love for their father as a weapon against me. As we crossed the district line into Maryland, the landscape began to change, and so did the atmosphere in the car. The city's vibrant, complicated tapestry gave way to the monotonous, empty stretches of the suburbs, and then to the even bleaker landscape of the rural exurbs. The trees grew thinner, the houses grew shabbier, the distance between streetlights grew longer. With every mile we drove away from the city, from my home, from my life, the pretense of concern in the car began to evaporate. The velvet glove was coming off. "The lawyers will be in touch about the estate," RJ said, his tone now all business. He was no longer speaking to his mother. He was speaking to a subordinate, a problem to be managed. "It's all very straightforward. Daddy left everything to us, of course, with the provision that you be cared for. This facility is part of that provision." Why? A cold, calculated, monstrous lie. Robert would never have left me to the mercy of his children. He would never have signed a document that would allow them to imprison me. But in that moment I had no way to fight back. I was trapped in a moving vehicle with no phone, no allies, no power. All I had was the cold, sinking realization that they had been planning this for a long time. The fake will, the legal groundwork, the choice of this remote, forgotten place. This was not a spontaneous act of cruelty. This was a meticulously orchestrated coup. When we finally arrived at Pleasant Meadows, my spirit, which had been fighting to stay afloat in a sea of shock and grief, finally sank. The building was a monument to despair. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence, not to keep intruders out but to keep residents in. The paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, the small, pathetic patch of lawn was mostly weeds. This was not a place for rest and recovery. This was a place where old people were sent to disappear, to die quietly and out of sight. RJ and Denise walked me inside, their grips on my elbows now firm, proprietary, leaving no room for escape. The lobby smelled of disinfectant and despair. A handful of residents were slumped in worn-out armchairs, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on a television that was blaring a game show. No one looked up as we entered. We were invisible, just another family bringing another piece of old furniture to be stored until it was ready for the scrap heap. At the reception desk, as RJ signed the papers that would strip me of my freedom, Denise delivered her final whispered verdict. "This is where you belong now, Mama. The house and the company are ours. We will manage the inheritance." The words were not just a statement, they were a sentence. She was passing judgment on my entire life, declaring it over, finished, irrelevant. She was a queen deposing her predecessor, and this bleak, hopeless place was my tower. As they turned and walked away, the automatic doors sliding shut behind them with a soft, final whoosh, I was left alone, a stranger in a strange land, a queen in exile, with nothing to my name but the funeral dress on my back and a single desperate memory of a promise my husband had made: get to Hayes. It was a whisper of hope in a hurricane of despair, the only thing left to cling to in the wreckage of my life. The first night at Pleasant Meadows was the longest night of my life. It was a descent into a circle of hell I had never imagined. After my children abandoned me in the lobby, the receptionist, Brenda, had processed me with the bored indifference of a bureaucrat handling a piece of paper. She hadn't made eye contact. She had simply taken the forms from RJ, stamped them, and then pointed a thumb down a long, dimly lit corridor. "Room 2B. Nurse will be with you shortly. There was no welcome, no kindness, no flicker of human compassion. I was not a person. I was a file, a bed number, a new liability to be managed. I walked down the hallway alone, my sensible funeral shoes making soft, mournful sounds on the scuffed linoleum. The air grew thicker with the smells of sickness and institutional food. Doors to other rooms were ajar, offering glimpses of other lives in their final, sad chapters. A woman staring at a television that wasn't on, a man talking to a photograph, the faint, ragged sound of someone weeping. This was my future. This was the community my children had chosen for me. Room 2B was a double. My roommate was a tiny, bird-like woman named Mildred, who was curled in a fetal position on the bed nearest the door, her eyes closed, a thin stream of spittle tracing a path down her chin. She did not stir as I entered. The only sign that she was alive was the faint, rhythmic rise and fall of the thin blanket covering her. The room was furnished with 2 beds, 2 metal nightstands, and 2 small closets. There was 1 chair. My bed, the one by the window, was neatly made, the thin beige blanket pulled taut. It looked as inviting as a slab in a morgue. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my hands clasped in my lap, my back ramrods straight. I was a statue of grief and shock. I did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside me, a glacier of unshed sorrow. To cry would be to surrender, to accept that this was my reality. And I could not. I would not. My mind, the only part of me they couldn't strip away, began to work. It began to analyze, to strategize, to do what I had done for 50 years at Sinclair & Son. I assessed my situation. I was a prisoner held against my will. I had no resources, no communication, no allies who knew where I was. My children had isolated me completely. They had chosen this place for its remoteness, for its lack of oversight, for its air of forgotten hopelessness. No one from my world, from the world of Crestwood and K Street, would ever think to look for me here. A nurse eventually bustled in, a large, impatient woman with a sour expression. She didn't introduce herself. She held a small paper cup with a single white pill in it. "For your nerves, dear," she said, her voice a jarringly cheerful boom. "Doctor's orders. Helps you settle in." "I don't want it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The nurse's smile tightened. Now, let's not be difficult. It's for your own good." She was treating me like a child, like an irrational creature who didn't know what was best for her. I knew what the pill was. It was a sedative. It was a chemical straitjacket designed to make me docile, compliant, manageable. It was the first step in the process of erasing my will, of turning Cynthia Sinclair into the blank, staring resident I had seen in the lobby. "I will not take it," I repeated, looking her directly in the eye. For a moment we were locked in a silent battle of wills. She was bigger, stronger, and held all the institutional power. But I had a lifetime of experience in facing down contractors who tried to cut corners and union bosses who tried to bully me. I did not blink. After a long, tense moment, she sighed, a gust of frustrated air. "Fine. Have it your way. But don't be ringing that call bell all night." She slammed the pill cup down on the nightstand and bustled out, leaving the pill behind as a silent testament to my small first victory. As darkness fell outside the grimy window, the reality of my situation began to truly sink in. The sounds of the facility intensified. The rattling of a dinner cart, the distant, incessant beeping of a machine, a sudden, piercing cry from down the hall that was abruptly cut off. Grief, raw and untamed, finally began to thaw the glacier inside me. I was not just grieving for Robert. I was grieving for my children, for the son and daughter I had loved and raised, who had somehow become these monstrous strangers. I was grieving for my home, for the life that had been stolen from me, for the future I had envisioned. A future of quiet widowhood, yes, but one of dignity, surrounded by family and memories. I lay down on the bed, not bothering to pull back the covers, the scratchy wool of my funeral dress a comfort in its formality. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness Robert's face appeared, as clear as if he were standing in the room. I saw him in his study, the lamplight glinting off his silver hair, his eyes full of a terrible, prescient sadness. I heard his voice, a low, urgent whisper that cut through the fog of my despair. "If they ever forget who you are, Cynthia, I've left you a key. Just get to Hayes." The memory was a jolt, an electric current that shot through my exhausted body. It was more than a memory. It was an instruction. A mission. Robert had known. He had seen this coming. He had not left me defenseless. He had armed me. He had given me a weapon and the name of the man who knew how to wield it. Lawrence Hayes. A brilliant young lawyer Robert had taken under his wing years ago. A man whose integrity was as solid as the foundations of the buildings we built. The knowledge was a shield against the encroaching despair. My children thought they had won. They thought they had buried me alive in this beige tomb. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated their father's foresight, and they had forgotten their mother's strength. I was not just a grieving widow. I was Cynthia Sinclair, the woman who had balanced the books, negotiated the contracts, and built an empire from a card table and a dream. I was not a resident. I was a prisoner of war. And as the longest night of my life finally began to give way to the first faint gray light of dawn, I began to formulate a plan of escape. The first rule of survival is to observe. For 2 days I did nothing but watch, listen, and learn the rhythms of my prison. Pleasant Meadows ran on a skeleton crew of overworked, underpaid staff and a routine that was as predictable as it was soul-crushing. Breakfast at 7, medication at 8, a mandatory hour in the day room at 10, lunch at noon. The afternoons were a long, unstructured desert of time, broken only by the 4 p.m. medication round and the 5:30 p.m. dinner. The staff for the most part were not cruel, they were exhausted. They moved with a weary, mechanical efficiency, their faces etched with a permanent fatigue. They had too many patients, too much paperwork, and too little time for genuine human interaction. Their indifference was my camouflage. As long as I was quiet, compliant, and didn't make waves, I was invisible. And in invisibility there was power. I identified the weak link in their system on the second day. Her name was Tasha. She was a young nursing aide, no older than 22, with kind, tired eyes and a gentle touch. Unlike the other, more hardened staff members, Tasha still possessed a spark of empathy. I saw it in the way she lingered for a moment to fix Mildred's blanket, the way she spoke to the residents as people, not as tasks to be completed. She was new to this world of institutionalized decay, and her spirit had not yet been crushed by it. She was my way out. My plan was simple, and it relied on playing the very role my children had assigned to me, the frail, confused, grieving old woman. On the third morning, as Tasha was taking my blood pressure, I looked at her, my eyes wide and full of a carefully manufactured confusion. "I need to call my son," I said, my voice a quavering whisper. "He'll be worried. I need to tell him I've arrived safely." Tasha's expression softened with pity. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice gentle. "Your son knows you're here. He's the one who brought you." No, I insisted, shaking my head, allowing a tear to well up and trace a path down my cheek. That was someone else. My son RJ, he doesn't know. He'll be frantic. Please, can I just call him? Just for a minute." I was playing a dangerous game. The facility had a strict no-phone policy for residents, especially new ones who were considered a flight risk. But I was banking on Tasha's kindness, on her inexperience, on the powerful pull of a mother's love for her child, a sentiment she could surely understand. I was using the truth of my children's identity to sell a lie about their intentions. Tasha hesitated, her brow furrowed with concern. She glanced nervously down the hallway. "I'm not supposed to," she whispered. "We could both get in a lot of trouble." "Just for 1 minute," I pleaded, reaching out and placing my hand on her arm. My touch was as light and fragile as a dried leaf. "I won't tell anyone. I promise." She looked at my face, at the tear tracking through my wrinkles, at the desperate plea in my eyes. And she broke. "Okay," she sighed, her resolve crumbling. "Hey, but you have to be quick. There's a phone in the staff lounge. I'll stand watch." She helped me to my feet and led me down a side corridor to a small, cluttered room that smelled of stale coffee and microwave popcorn. She pointed to a beige landline phone on a desk. "Be fast," she whispered before stepping back into the hallway to act as a lookout. My heart was hammering against my ribs. My hands trembled as I picked up the receiver. I had one call. One chance. I could not call the police. It would be my word against my children's, and they had the legal documents to prove I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I could not call my home. They would have already changed the locks. I had to call the one person who would understand, the one person who would believe me without question, the one person who held a lifetime of my trust. I dialed the number from memory, a number that was as familiar to me as my own name. Beatrice B. Du Bois answered on the second ring, her voice a familiar, comforting boom. Hello. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I couldn't explain. I didn't have time. I had to trust that the plan Robert B. and I had half-jokingly concocted years ago, a contingency for a disaster we never truly believed would happen, would hold. B. I said, my voice low and urgent. It's Cynthia. Cynthia. My goodness, I've been trying to reach you since the funeral. Your phone just goes to voicemail. Are you alright? Where are you? Listen to me, B. I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I don't have time. Just listen. I paused, gathering all my strength, and spoke the two words that would ignite a firestorm. Code Samson. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Code Samson. It was a reference to the biblical story of Samson, the strong man who was betrayed, blinded, and imprisoned by his enemies, and who, in his final act, brought the entire temple crashing down upon their heads. It was our code word for the ultimate betrayal, a crisis of unimaginable proportions that required immediate, decisive, and ruthless action. The silence was broken by the sound of B's sharp, indrawn breath. The warm, friendly grandmother was gone. In her place was the retired Howard University professor, the woman who had marched with King, the woman who had faced down university deans and city councilmen, the woman whose intellect was as sharp and unforgiving as a surgeon's scalpel. Understood, she said, her voice now cold, clipped, and all business. Location. Pleasant Meadows, I whispered. Rural Maryland. I don't know where. I'll find it, she said, her voice a low, dangerous promise. Don't say another word. I'm on my way. Sit tight, my friend. The cavalry is coming. She hung up. I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle, my hand no longer shaking. A profound sense of relief washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. I had sent the signal. The first domino had been pushed. I had done my part. Now I had to trust in my army of two, the brilliant, loyal friend who was my strategist, and the quiet, implacable lawyer who held the keys to my husband's kingdom. I walked out of the staff lounge and back to my room, my steps slow and measured. I resumed my role as the frail, quiet widow. But inside, my heart was beating with the steady, powerful rhythm of a war drum. B. Du Bois did not arrive like a concerned friend. She arrived like a force of nature, a hurricane in a sensible Buick. Less than 3 hours after my cryptic call, the quiet, soul-crushing monotony of Pleasant Meadows was shattered. I was in the day room, enduring the mandatory hour of forced socialization, when I heard a commotion from the lobby. It was B's voice, a rich, commanding alto that could silence a lecture hall of rowdy freshmen, and it was radiating a righteous fury that could peel paint off the walls. I don't give a damn what your policy is, she was booming, and I could picture her standing there, her 5'4" frame radiating the authority of a 6-star general. I am here to see my friend Cynthia Sinclair, and I am not leaving without her. You can either show me to her room, or you can explain to my lawyer, who is on his way, why you are holding an 80-year-old woman against her will. The choice is yours. The staff, accustomed to dealing with the downtrodden and the defeated, had no idea how to handle a woman like B. She was not intimidated by their bureaucratic stonewalling. She was not moved by their talk of rules and regulations. She was a force of pure, unadulterated will, and she was on a mission. A flustered-looking Brenda, the receptionist, appeared at the door of the day room, her face pale. Cynthia Sinclair, she squeaked. You have a visitor. I rose slowly, my movements deliberate, and walked towards the lobby. The moment B saw me, her face, which had been a mask of cold fury, crumpled with a mixture of relief and heartbreak. She rushed to me, pulling me into a fierce, protective hug. Oh, Cynthia, she whispered into my hair. My God, what have they done to you? She pulled back, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. My funeral dress, which I had now been wearing for 3 days, the exhaustion etched on my face, the bleak, hopeless environment around me. Her gaze hardened again, her anger returning with a vengeance. She turned to Brenda. Pack her things, she commanded. Brenda stammered. She doesn't have any things. B's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. Excuse me. Her children left her here with nothing, Brenda said, her voice barely a whisper. The information landed like a grenade in the silent lobby. B stared at me, her expression a mixture of horror and disbelief. Then she turned back to Brenda, her voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. Get the discharge papers. Now. The process was a blur of frantic, intimidated activity. The facility's director, a nervous man with a cheap suit and shifty eyes, was summoned. He tried to bluster to talk of legal guardianship and sign documents. Bea was having none of it. She pulled out her phone, put it on speaker and dialed a number. "Lawrence Hayes, please," she said. A moment later, a calm, authoritative voice filled the lobby. "This is Lawrence Hayes." "Mr. Hayes," Bea said, her voice crisp and clear. "This is Beatrice Dubois. I am here at the Pleasant Meadows Senior Care Facility. They are refusing to release Cynthia Sinclair into my care, citing some paperwork signed by her son. I believe this constitutes unlawful imprisonment. What is our legal position?" The disembodied voice of Lawrence Hayes was as calm and deadly as a sniper's scope. "Our position," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cheap, linoleum-floored lobby, "is that if Mrs. Sinclair is not released into your custody within the next 5 minutes, I will be contacting the State Attorney General to report a case of elder abuse and kidnapping. I will also be filing a civil suit against this facility for a sum that will ensure it ceases to exist by the end of the fiscal year. Am I making myself clear?" The director's bluster evaporated. He began to sweat. He snatched the clipboard from Brenda and signed the discharge papers with a trembling hand. 10 minutes later, I was walking out of the automatic doors of Pleasant Meadows, Bea's arms securely around my shoulders. I was free. As we settled into the comfortable leather seats of Bea's Buick, the familiar scent of her rose-scented perfume a welcome antidote to the stench of the nursing home, I finally allowed the tears that had been frozen inside me to fall. They were not tears of sadness but of profound, overwhelming relief. We drove back to D.C. in a comfortable silence, broken only by Bea's occasional muttered curses directed at my children. She didn't press me for details. She knew I would tell her when I was ready. She simply drove, her presence a warm, solid comfort beside me. She took me to her home on Decatur Street, just 2 blocks from my own, a beautiful, stately house filled with books, art and the memories of a 60-year friendship. She ran a hot bath for me, gave me one of her own soft silk robes to wear, and made me a cup of strong sweet tea. As I sat in her warm, inviting kitchen, wrapped in the comfort of her friendship, I finally told her everything. I told her about the funeral, about the long, silent drive, about the cold, cruel words my children had spoken. I told her about the beige room, the sedative, the feeling of being buried alive. She listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with every word. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "They have made a grave miscalculation, Cynthia," she said, her voice a low, simmering promise of retribution. "They think they are at war with a frail old woman. They have forgotten that they are at war with you. And with me. This is not just about getting you back on your feet. This is about taking back everything they have stolen. Your home, your company, your dignity. We are going to hold a war council. And then we are going to call in the cavalry." The fire of battle was in her eyes. My strategist was ready. The first phase of the operation was complete. Now it was time to unleash the weapon Robert had left behind. The next morning I stood in front of the full-length mirror in Bea's guest bedroom, dressed in a borrowed suit of cream-colored wool. Bea, a masterful curator of classic fashion, had an impeccable wardrobe. The suit fit as if it were tailored for me, its clean, elegant lines a stark contrast to the shapeless, black funeral dress that had been my uniform for the past 4 days. Looking at my reflection, I began to see a glimmer of the woman I used to be, the woman I still was, beneath the layers of grief and trauma. My eyes were tired, yes, but they were clear. My back was straight. My resolve was hardening into steel. I was not a victim. I was a queen preparing to reclaim her throne. Bea drove me to K Street, the nerve center of Washington, D.C.'s legal and political power. The glass and steel towers that lined the street were monuments to ambition, a world away from the peeling paint and despair of Pleasant Meadows. We were not going to battle in the muddy trenches of family drama. We were taking this fight to the highest echelons of power, where the weapons were contracts, injunctions, and the unassailable logic of the law. The offices of Hayes, Thorne and Associates were on the top floor of one of the newest, most impressive buildings. The reception area was a study in quiet, expensive taste, dark wood, brushed steel, and a panoramic view of the city that stretched all the way to the Washington Monument. A young, impeccably dressed receptionist greeted us with a respectful smile. Mrs. Sinclair, Mrs. Dubois. Mr. Hayes is expecting you. Lawrence Hayes was waiting for us in a large, sun-drenched conference room. He was a tall, athletic man of about 45, with a calm, reassuring presence that belied the razor-sharp intellect I knew he possessed. He had been one of Robert's brightest protégés, a young man from a humble background whom Robert had mentored, sponsored through law school and treated like a son. His loyalty to my husband was absolute, and his grief at his passing I knew was genuine. He greeted me not with pity but with a profound, quiet respect. He took both my hands in his. "Cynthia," he said, his voice full of a deep, sorrowful warmth. "I am so sorry for your loss. And I am even more sorry for what you have been forced to endure." Robert would be incandescent with rage. He would be, I agreed, my voice steady. But he would also be prepared. He told me, Lawrence. He told me to come to you. A flicker of understanding, of grim, sad confirmation, passed through his eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice dropping. "He did. He foresaw this. He hoped he was wrong, but he was a pragmatist. He always had a contingency plan." He gestured for us to sit at the long, polished mahogany table. "Let's get to work." He opened a thick leather-bound portfolio that was sitting in the center of the table. "RJ and Denise have already been in contact with me," he began, his tone now all business. "They presented me with a copy of what they believe to be your husband's last will and testament. It's a simple, straightforward document, leaving the entirety of the Sinclair estate, including the company and all personal property, to be divided equally between them, with a small, vaguely worded clause about ensuring your continued care and comfort. It is, for all intents and purposes, a complete forgery." "B," gasped. I remained silent. I had suspected as much. "Robert was a meticulous planner," Lawrence continued. "He knew his children's character. For the past 2 years, as his health declined, we worked together to create a new comprehensive estate plan. A plan designed to protect you, and to protect his legacy from those who would squander it. What your children have is a decoy, a well-crafted piece of fiction we created and intentionally leaked to them through a junior associate they had on their payroll. We knew they would take the bait." He slid a thick, blue-backed document across the table to me. "This," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet, triumphant gravity, "is Robert's true last will and testament. And it is a work of art." He proceeded to walk us through the details of a plan so intricate, so brilliant, so perfectly designed to counter his children's greed, that it took my breath away. The will was not the central document. The will was merely a key that activated something far more powerful. The Sinclair Legacy Trust. It was a master discretionary trust, an ironclad legal fortress into which Robert had placed every single asset he owned. The company, Sinclair & Son Construction, was not a standalone entity. It was a wholly owned subsidiary of the trust. The house in Crestwood, the vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, the cars, the art collection, the entire multi-million-dollar stock portfolio, everything was an asset of the trust. And a discretionary trust, Lawrence explained, is controlled by one person and one person only, the trustee. The trustee has the sole, absolute and unquestionable authority to manage and distribute the assets as they see fit, according to the terms laid out in the trust document. "And who," Bea asked, leaning forward, her eyes gleaming, "is the trustee?" Lawrence smiled, a slow, grim smile of satisfaction. "Initially, the trustee was to be Robert himself. But the trust contains a very specific, very powerful clause. A clause I have come to think of as the dead man's switch. The clause states that upon Robert's death, all power of the trustee is to be held in abeyance. The trust is to be frozen, locked down completely. No assets can be moved, no money can be spent, no decisions can be made. It remains in that locked state until a specific condition is met." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. He looked directly at me, his eyes full of a fierce, protective loyalty. "The trust can only be activated," he said, his voice a low, powerful declaration, "when you, Cynthia Sinclair, are physically present in this office, and you provide me with a specific verbal password, a password known only to you and to Robert. Upon activation, you do not just become the beneficiary of the trust. You become the sole successor trustee with absolute and total control over every single asset. Without you and without that password, your children have control over absolutely nothing. They have inherited a kingdom, but the keys, Cynthia, the keys have been in your possession all along. The first tremors of the earthquake hit RJ's world at 10:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. He was in his father's office. His office now, a sprawling top-floor suite with panoramic views of the city. He was, as B later described it after a satisfying call with a contact at the company, in the middle of a meeting with an interior designer, discussing plans to replace his father's classic understated mahogany furniture with something more modern and dynamic. In other words, something chrome and glass that would look good on his Instagram feed. He was in the process of erasing his father's memory, of stamping his own shallow brand on the empire he had so easily acquired. His first act as the new self-appointed CEO of Sinclair & Son was to reward himself for a job well done. He had instructed the company's chief financial officer to wire $500,000 from the corporate operating accounts to his personal account. It was, he had explained, a long-overdue bonus for his years of service to the company. The CFO, a cautious, meticulous man who had been with us for 30 years, had balked, but RJ had pulled rank, waving the forged will in his face as proof of his new authority. Reluctantly, the CFO had initiated the transfer. The call from the bank came just as RJ was approving a design for a $9,000 desk. The bank's vice president of commercial accounts, a man RJ had played golf with just a few weeks prior, was on the line, his tone formal and frosty. The wire transfer had been denied. Furthermore, a system-wide freeze had just been placed on all accounts associated with Sinclair & Son Construction and the Sinclair family estate. No funds could be moved, no checks could be cleared, no credit lines could be accessed. RJ, I was told, had exploded. He had screamed, he had threatened, he had dropped the names of every important person he knew. The banker was unmoved. The freeze, he explained, had been initiated by a legal directive from the law firm of Hayes, Thorne and Associates, citing a primary trust document that superseded any and all previously filed wills. All assets were now under the sole control of a trustee, pending further instructions. Any further inquiries, the banker had said with a cool finality, should be directed to Mr. Lawrence Hayes. The panic must have been immediate and profound. RJ's entire world was built on a foundation of credit and cash flow. He lived a lifestyle that far outstripped his actual salary, a lifestyle subsidized by the quiet, steady river of money that flowed from the company. That river had just been dammed. His next call was to his sister. Denise was, at that very moment, at the exclusive Mazza Gallery Mall in Friendship Heights, in the middle of a consultation with a personal shopper at Neiman Marcus. She had been celebrating her new inheritance by purchasing an entirely new fall wardrobe. When the cashier tried to run her Sinclair corporate credit card, the one she used for all her personal expenses under the guise of client entertainment, it was declined. A second card, a personal American Express that was paid off every month by the company, was also declined. Humiliated and furious, she had stormed out of the store just as her phone rang with the frantic, sputtering rage of her brother. The gates to the kingdom had not just been closed, they had been welded shut. The beautiful, intricate trap that Robert and Lawrence had designed was now fully sprung. For 2 years, they had painstakingly transferred every asset, every stock certificate, every property deed, into the impenetrable fortress of the Sinclair Legacy Trust. RJ and Denise had inherited a set of keys, but the keys were to an empty house. The real treasure was locked in a vault, and the combination was a password whispered from a dying husband to his beloved wife. I had provided that password to Lawrence just the day before. After he had explained the full, beautiful scope of Robert's plan, he had looked at me, his expression gentle. "Cynthia," he had said. "What's the password?" I had looked out the window of his office at the city Robert and I had built together. And I had spoken the name of the first, small, impossible project we had ever undertaken, the project that had launched our dreams, the foundation upon which everything else was built. "Anacostia," I had said, my voice clear and strong. With that single word, the dead man's switch had been thrown. The trust was activated. And I, Cynthia Sinclair, the grieving widow my children had discarded in a beige room in the middle of nowhere, had become the sole, undisputed and all-powerful trustee of the Sinclair fortune. I was now the chairwoman of the board, the CEO, the CFO, and the sole shareholder. I was the bank. And the bank was now officially closed. The parasites who had feasted on the host for their entire lives had just had their meal ticket permanently revoked. The panic was just beginning. The real squeeze was yet to come. The days that followed were a masterclass in strategic, bloodless warfare, orchestrated by Lawrence with the precision of a chess grandmaster and fueled by the righteous, long-simmering anger of B. I was the queen, the central piece on the board, but they were my rooks and bishops, moving across the board with a quiet, lethal efficiency, dismantling my children's lives piece by painful piece. My instructions to Lawrence were simple. I don't just want them to feel the consequences, Lawrence. I want them to understand them. I want them to understand that everything they have, everything they are, came from a foundation they never bothered to respect. It's time to show them what it's like to live without it. Lawrence began by formally notifying RJ and Denise of the activation of the Sinclair Legacy Trust. The letter, delivered by courier to their respective homes, was a cold, legalistic masterpiece. It informed them that the will they possessed was null and void, that all assets were now under the control of the trust, and that the sole successor trustee was their mother, Cynthia Sinclair. It was a declaration of war, a formal announcement that the old regime was dead and the true queen had reclaimed her throne. The first and most symbolic blow was the reclamation of the company cars. RJ drove a top-of-the-line black Cadillac Escalade, Denise a silver Mercedes G-Wagon. Both were owned by the company, their insurance and maintenance paid for as a corporate expense. On Thursday morning, 2 flatbed trucks from a repossession company arrived simultaneously, one at RJ's office building downtown, the other in the circular driveway of Denise's sprawling Potomac mansion. The drivers, impassive and professional, presented the paperwork signed by the new trustee and proceeded to winch the luxury vehicles onto the trucks. RJ, I was told, had to take a taxi home. Denise was forced to drive her husband's much less glamorous Lexus. It was a small, public humiliation, a clear signal that their status, which they had always worn as comfortably as a second skin, was being systematically stripped away. The next move was aimed at their homes. Denise's mansion, while in her husband's name, had been purchased with a substantial down payment that had been a gift from Robert and me, a gift that had come directly from the company's accounts. Lawrence's team of forensic accountants traced the payment and sent a letter to Denise's husband, politely informing him that the gift was now being reclassified as a corporate loan, payable to the trust on demand. The interest, Lawrence noted, would be retroactive. The foundation of their lavish home was suddenly resting on a mountain of unexpected debt. RJ's situation was even more precarious. He lived in a sleek, modern penthouse condominium in the city, a property that was owned outright by a holding company. A holding company that was, of course, a subsidiary of the Sinclair Legacy Trust. He was in effect a tenant. Lawrence sent him a formal eviction notice, giving him 30 days to vacate the property. The penthouse, the letter explained, was a corporate asset that was being liquidated. The squeeze tightened. The country club memberships, the expense accounts, the corporate credit cards, all were cancelled. The river of money that had irrigated their lives had dried up into a desert of financial reality. They were, for the first time in their adult lives, forced to live on their own salaries. RJ's salary from Sinclair and Son had been generous, but it was a fraction of what he spent. Denise had never worked a day in her life. She was entirely dependent on her husband, a man who was now facing a sudden massive debt to her mother's trust. Panic gave way to bitter, frantic infighting. B, who had a vast and efficient network of sources throughout Black DC society, gave me daily updates. RJ and Denise were at each other's throats. He blamed her for pushing him to act so rashly, for her insatiable need for a grander lifestyle. She blamed him for his arrogance, for his sloppy handling of the situation, for failing to secure their inheritance before their mother could react. Their alliance, which had been forged in the crucible of shared greed, was dissolving in the acid of shared failure. They had been a united front when they were carving up the spoils of a kingdom they thought was undefended. But now that the kingdom had struck back, they were turning on each other like starving wolves fighting over a scrap of meat. I took no pleasure in their misery. I felt a deep, profound sadness for the two people they had become. But I knew this was a necessary cruelty. It was a painful, radical surgery designed to cut out the cancer of entitlement that had been poisoning them for their entire lives. They had never known what it was like to worry about a mortgage payment, to balance a checkbook, to live within their means. They had never understood the value of $1 because they had never had to earn an honest one. Their father and I had built a fortress to protect them from the harsh realities of the world. Now I was forcing them to live outside its walls. I had taken away their cars, their homes, their money. I had taken away the very things they thought defined them. I was leaving them with nothing but their own character to fall back on. And I knew, with a mother's sorrowful certainty, that it was the one thing they were utterly bankrupt in. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not in the sterile, controlled environment of a lawyer's office, but on the familiar, sacred ground of B's front porch. It was a Sunday afternoon, a week after their world had been systematically dismantled. I was sitting in a rocking chair, a cup of tea in my hand, enjoying the warm autumn sun when a taxi pulled up to the curb. RJ and Denise spilled out of it, their faces a ruin of stress and fury. They looked diminished, stripped of their usual confident swagger. The absence of their luxury cars was a more eloquent statement than any legal document. They were no longer the masters of the universe. They were just two people who had to pay a cab fare. They stormed up the walkway, their steps a frantic, angry rhythm on the flagstones. B, who had seen them arrive from the living room window, met them at the door, her body a formidable 5'4" blockade. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with an icy politeness that was far more insulting than any shout. "We're here to see our mother," RJ snapped, trying to push past her. B didn't budge. She placed a hand flat on his chest, her strength surprising. "Your mother," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "is not accepting visitors who conspired to lock her in a cage and steal her life's work. You are not welcome in this house. This is a family matter, B," Denise hissed, her face contorted with a rage that stripped away the last vestiges of her polished composure. "It has nothing to do with you. Let us in." "Everything that concerns Cynthia Sinclair has something to do with me," B retorted, her eyes flashing. "And you too forfeited your right to call this a family matter, when you treated your own mother with a cruelty that would shame a stranger." I decided to intervene. Their loud, angry voices were a disruption to the peace of this quiet, dignified street. And more than that, I wanted to face them. I needed to see them, to look into their eyes and see if there was any flicker of remorse, any glimmer of understanding, beneath the layers of their selfish rage. "It's all right, B," I said, my voice calm and steady as I rose from my chair. "Let them come up. I'll speak to them." B shot me a look of concern, but she stepped aside. RJ and Denise stormed onto the porch, their faces flushed, their eyes wild. They stopped a few feet from me, their chests heaving. For a moment we just stared at each other in a tense, heavy silence. They were my children. I had given them life, I had nursed them through fevers, I had celebrated their triumphs and soothed their fears. And now they were looking at me with a hatred that was as pure and cold as a winter stone. "How could you do this to us?" Denise finally shrieked, her voice cracking with a self-pity that was utterly devoid of self-awareness. "Your own children. We're being ruined. Our friends are laughing at us. We have nothing." "Nothing," I repeated, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a lifetime of disappointment. "You have your health. You have your education. You have your spouses and your children. You think nothing is having to drive a Lexus instead of a Mercedes? You think nothing is having to live in a house that you might actually have to pay for yourselves?" I was in a room with a dying woman wearing the same dress for 3 days with no phone, no money, no hope. That is nothing. You have no comprehension of what the word means. "This is about the money, isn't it?" RJ sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You were always so obsessed with the money, with the ledgers and the bottom line. You couldn't stand the thought of us having it." The accusation was so monstrous, so fundamentally ignorant of the truth of my life, that it didn't even sting. It was the desperate, flailing attack of a man who had no moral ground to stand on. "This has never been about the money," I said, my voice as cold and hard as his. "It is about respect. It is about character. Your father and I built an empire on a foundation of integrity, hard work, and mutual respect. You saw it as nothing more than a pile of cash to be divided. You didn't want to inherit a legacy. You wanted to win the lottery. You threw me away like a piece of trash because you thought I was standing between you and the prize. You were so blinded by your greed that you couldn't see the truth that was standing right in front of you. I was the prize. I held the keys. I always held the keys." They stared at me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. They couldn't comprehend it. They couldn't grasp the idea that their quiet, unassuming mother had been the true power behind the throne all along. They couldn't understand the intricate, brilliant trap their father had laid, and that I had so willingly sprung. Their world was simple, transactional. They believed that power came from a will, from a piece of paper. They didn't understand that true power, the kind that endures, comes from knowledge, from loyalty, from a lifetime of quiet, diligent work. "What do you want from us?" RJ finally asked, his voice a broken whisper. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the dawning, terrifying realization of his own powerlessness. "Want?" I asked, a sad, bitter laugh escaping my lips. I wanted a son and a daughter who loved and respected me. I wanted a family that would honor the memory of the great man who gave them everything. It is far too late for what I wanted. I looked at them, at the ruins of the family I had tried to build, and I knew that the time for anger was over. The time for judgment had arrived. "What is going to happen now?" I said, my voice leaving no room for argument, "is that you are going to listen. You're going to listen to my terms. And you're going to accept them. Because you have no other choice." I did not deliver my ultimatum on the porch. The street was no place for the final, painful surgery that needed to be performed. I had them come inside into B's formal living room, a room that had witnessed 60 years of our family's history, christenings, birthdays, and now this final, sorrowful reckoning. They sat on a stiff, antique sofa, looking small and out of place, like errant children called into the principal's office. B and I sat opposite them in high-backed armchairs, a tribunal of two. There was no tea, no pleasantries. This was not a negotiation. It was a sentencing. "This is not about revenge," I began, my voice calm and measured, devoid of the anger and hurt that had been my constant companions for the past week. "Revenge is a passion. This is a lesson. It is the final, most important lesson your father and I will ever teach you. It is a lesson in character." They stared at me, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. The fight was gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful resignation. They were waiting to hear the price of their freedom, the size of the ransom. They still thought this was about money. "You have lived your entire lives in a bubble," I continued, "a beautiful, comfortable bubble that your father and I built for you. We protected you from struggle, from want, from the consequences of your own actions. That was our mistake. Our love for you became a crutch, and you never learned to stand on your own 2 feet. That ends today. The bubble is gone." I laid out my terms, each one a carefully chosen tool designed not to punish, but to reshape them, to force them to confront the world as it was, not as they wished it to be. "First," I said, "the company. Sinclair and Son is no longer a family business. It is a corporation, and it will be run as such. I am the acting chairwoman of the board. I am hiring a new professional CEO from outside the family. RJ, you are no longer an executive. Your position has been eliminated. You will be offered a mid-level project manager position, at a salary commensurate with that role. You will report to a supervisor. You will be expected to be in the office at 8 a.m. every morning. You will learn the business from the ground up the way your father did. You will learn the value of a day's work because you will finally have to do one." RJ's face went pale. The thought of being a mere employee in the company he thought he owned, of taking orders and earning a salary, was an indignity he had never contemplated. "Denise," I said, turning to my daughter, "you have never had a job. Your new job is to manage your own household on your husband's actual income. The trust will not be subsidizing your life any longer. The loan to your husband for the down payment on your house will be restructured with a fair, manageable interest rate, but it will be paid. You will learn to live within a budget. You will learn the difference between what you want and what you need." Denise began to weep, silent, bitter tears of self-pity. "Second," I continued, my voice unyielding, "the assets. The trust will provide each of you with a small monthly stipend. It will be enough to cover your basic necessities but not your luxuries. It is not an allowance. It is a safety net, and it is conditional. It is conditional on your continued employment and your adherence to the terms I am laying out. I saved the most important condition for last, the one that was not about money or work but about humility. And third," I said, my voice softening slightly but losing none of its steel, "you will volunteer. Every Saturday for the next year, you will both spend 4 hours at the Pleasant Meadows Senior Care Facility. You will not be there as donors or as visitors. You will be there as volunteers. You will read to the residents. You will write letters for them. You will feed those who cannot feed themselves. You will listen to their stories. You will learn to see the humanity in the people you were so willing to discard me among. You will learn empathy. You will learn respect. You will learn that a person's value is not measured by their bank account, but by the dignity they are afforded in their final years. The room was silent. The sentence had been delivered. It was a sentence of hard labor, of forced humility, of a long, slow, painful education in the very values they had spent their lives ignoring. After 1 year, I concluded, 1 year of proven, genuine change, of demonstrated humility and hard work, we will revisit this arrangement. I will reconsider your role in this family and in your father's legacy. But make no mistake. This is not a negotiation. These are the terms of my forgiveness. And they are the only terms you will be offered. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. You have 24 hours to inform Lawrence Hayes of your acceptance. If you refuse, the stipend will be withdrawn, RJ's job offer will be rescinded, and the trust will proceed with the immediate liquidation of all assets, including your homes. You will be left with truly and completely nothing. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them to contemplate the ruins of their old lives and the difficult, uncertain path of their new ones. I did not know if they would accept. I did not know if they were capable of the kind of profound change I was demanding of them. But I knew I had done the right thing. I had taken away their inheritance, the unearned wealth that had poisoned their souls, and offered them something far more valuable in its place. A chance, however slim, at redemption. 6 months later, I sat in the office that had once been Robert's, the office that RJ had so briefly and arrogantly claimed as his own. The chrome and glass furniture he had ordered had been cancelled. The room was exactly as Robert had left it, a sanctuary of warm mahogany, worn leather, and the faint, comforting smell of old books and pipe tobacco. I was not the CEO. As promised, I had hired a brilliant, dynamic woman from Chicago to run the day-to-day operations of the company. My title was chairwoman of the board, a role I embraced not as a position of power, but as one of stewardship. I was the guardian of my husband's legacy, the keeper of the flame. My first act as chairwoman was to establish the Sinclair Foundation, a charitable arm of the company dedicated to funding scholarships for promising young black architects and engineers at Howard University, and to building affordable, high-quality housing for the elderly in the city. I had taken the wealth my children had tried to steal and transformed it into a force for good, ensuring that the name Sinclair would be associated not with greed, but with generosity and community. The foundation was my new passion, a way to honor Robert's memory by investing in the future he had so believed in. My children, to my profound and continuing surprise, had accepted my terms. Their acceptance, I believe, was born not of a sudden change of heart, but of the cold, hard reality of their own bankruptcy, both financial and moral. They had no other choice. RJ was now a project manager. He worked out of a small, windowless office in the basement of the company headquarters. He wore a hard hat and steel-toed boots more often than he wore a suit. He was, by all accounts, a sullen but competent employee. He did his job, he collected his paycheck, and he went home. The arrogant, swaggering prince was gone, replaced by a quiet, resentful man who was slowly, painfully learning the meaning of work. I did not know if true change was happening in his heart, but I saw a flicker of it one afternoon when I visited a work site and saw him patiently explaining a blueprint to a young carpenter. It was the first time I had ever seen him teach rather than command. It was a small, fragile seed of hope. Denise's transformation was, in some ways, even more dramatic. Stripped of her endless line of credit, she had been forced to learn the mundane, difficult art of domestic management. She had fired her housekeeper, her nanny, and her gardener. She was learning to cook, to clean, to manage a budget. Her life was no longer a performance for the society pages. It was a daily struggle to maintain a household and raise her children on a real-world income. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, were now often chapped from washing dishes. Their Saturdays at Pleasant Meadows were the crucible in which their characters were being tested. I never visited them there. I received reports from Tasha, the young aide who had been my savior, whom I had since hired as the first director of my new foundation's elderly care division. She told me that at first they were resentful and clumsy, going through the motions with a barely concealed contempt. But slowly something had begun to shift. Denise, Tasha told me, had formed a genuine bond with Mildred, my former roommate. She would read to her for hours, her voice soft and patient. RJ, to everyone's surprise, had discovered a talent for organizing a weekly poker game for the men on the ward, his old glad-handing skills finally being put to a worthy use. They were, perhaps for the first time in their lives, performing acts of service that had no audience, no social benefit, no financial reward. They were learning to see the person behind the patient, the story behind the silent, staring eyes. I did not know if they would ever earn back their place in my heart, if the deep, ragged wound of their betrayal would ever truly heal. Some things once broken can never be made whole again. But I had given them a path. My revenge was not their destruction. It was their reconstruction. I had forced them to dismantle the false, hollow lives they had built and to begin the hard, unglamorous work of building new ones, brick by painful brick, on a foundation of humility and work. But I will always pray for them.